Welcome to another episode of Inside Startup Investing. As always, I am your host, Chris Lustrino, founder and CEO of KingsCrowd. Inside Startup Investing is a #1 podcast for learning about the best startups and investors in the online private markets. If you are a startup investor, this is a show for you. This podcast is powered by KingsCrowd's proprietary rating technology that helps us to uncover the best founders and stories that you need to hear about before clicking invest. Now, before we get started, we want to thank our sponsor, LawCloud, the premier solution for founders to prepare to raise capital online. Whether you need to file a Form C, a Form 1A, or a subscription agreement, LawCloud provides the lowest cost, easiest to use toolkit for founders to make raising capital online easier than ever. Now, on to today's show. I am joined by another Chris Lindsay, who is the CEO of Manta Biofuel. Manta Biofuel is a really cool company. If you care about, our earth and finding new and innovative ways to take care of it, this is a company that I think you will find very interesting. It lies really at the intersection of kind of new power sources as well as cleaning up our waterways. And it kind of converges in the middle of those two, which he will do a much better job of explaining than I will. So with that, I want to kick it off and send it on over to Chris. Chris, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Chris, great to meet you. Thank you very much for having us. Really appreciate the opportunity.
No problem. And for those who are not watching, it appears as though you're in a relatively interesting space, a bit of a factory of some sort or something. Can you tell us where you're at right now?
Absolutely. We're in our lovely laboratory area. It's a sort of no-frills situation here. It's basically converted warehouse space that we're trying to get every possible nook and cranny used for our development purposes.
That's really cool. Well, to kick it off, Chris, can you tell us really what Manta Biofuel is all about and what you all do?
So Manta was actually started as a biofuels company, and we can get into this whenever you want, Chris, but and talk about a bit of the pivot that we made. But we started as a biofuels company, and really over the last 18, 24 months, we've evolved the company more into the direction of water remediation, and we've got some fantastic technology that we can utilize to address acute water pollution issues. So it's pretty cool. Really excited to tell you more about it.
Before we get into that, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your background. And if you don't mind telling us a little bit about the background of the founder of the organization and how this company came to be.
Sure, absolutely. So my background, I basically grew up in the biotech world. I started, been now amazingly, I guess it's just about 30 years in biotech. Everything from working on the bench to driving business sides of things. So, that for me, the ability to actually take an idea, a concept from the bench to something that is a commercially viable offering out there has really been my passion. And so that's one of the things that really certainly drew me to Manta. Manta as a whole, it was founded by Ryan Powell, Dr. Ryan Powell, as an extension or culmination of his PhD work that he was doing at the University of Maryland, where he was studying the use of microalgae as a source of biofuels. And actually, as part of that, so there's the biofuels component, growing the algae, then there's also the component of harvesting the algae from ponds, which obviously for fuel, anything dealing with fuels has to be as low cost as possible. So it was sort of those two key parts that helped drive the foundation of Manta. Ryan himself I think comes from a 4th generation farm family in Ohio, which is one of his fantastic traits. I mean, he's an extremely practical guy, exceptionally smart, sort of got everything from the academic PhD side to things to the farmer practicality that this sort of helps us blend everything together.
You talk a little bit about the fact that you've all kind of had a pivot within the business. Can you talk to us about what that looks like?
Sure, absolutely. So we started off as biofuel. So the concept was we're going to grow algae in huge open ponds, then recover that algae from these ponds using some proprietary technology for magnetic separation. And I can get into that in a second, Chris. And then the algae that we then harvested would then be converted to biofuels with some high temperature, high pressure equipment. Pretty interesting stuff as we went along. Last year, well, I guess it was late 2021, we had just raised some additional funds through our first crowdfunding campaign, and we were sort of at an inflection point for us, for the company. It was evident that for us to really advance the biofuels angle the way we wanted to, the way we needed to, it was going to take really significant investment, probably orders of magnitude more investment than we had been able to procure to that point. Also around the same time, we were doing some bench work and some development work using our magnetic separation technology to not only remove algae from one of our ponds, but we were able to remove other quote-unquote contaminants from our pond, and that included things like nitrates and phosphates, which, as many people know, that's actually one of the big problems that lead to algal blooms and things like that in nature. So you get too much of these nutrients that are occurring in the nature, and you get these blooms that take off. So at that point, we were saying, okay, we have to really either drive investment really massively to drive the algal biofuels angle, or we've got this interesting prospect with water remediation. And we made the decision to pivot into the water remediation side because that was our clearest path to accelerate revenue generation. So we basically said it's a long road to get to algal biofuels. We're looking at this more mature technology that we have with our harvester or our magnetic separation. And then we started to dig into that market. We said, okay, there's actually a really nice market that we could build a great business with in water remediation, addressing water pollution issues. And it also, quite frankly, scratched the itch that we have as a company for doing good. It wasn't like we pivoted into something that wasn't having a real impact for the world as it stands. So that was a bit of the pivot that we moved into.
I'd like to just take a couple steps back. So let's start with, what is a biofuel? Why is it better for the earth? Let's define that.
Basically, a biofuel is a renewable resource. So you're now using components as opposed to fossil fuels, which are basically one and done, right? So we all know that that's coming from long decayed matter that is going to be used for your fuel now. Biofuels is something that's renewable. And so in our particular case, the idea was to look at algae as the source of carbon, because it all sort of boils down to carbon and then a carbon source. And so using algae as your carbon source as opposed to hydrocarbons is the way to go. And so that's really sort of the primary difference for a biofuel versus other hydrocarbons.
Now we know what a biofuel is. Can you talk a little bit about why there's such a long road to biofuels maybe being adopted at larger scale?
I'm sure you and your listeners well know when it comes to the fuel market, it really is all about economics, right? You have to have massive scale to be able to be successful in that market. Frankly, that was a big part of the technology development from our perspective around our magnetic separation, because we were trying to scrape out and shave out every possible cost in the production of biofuels. Even with that, the cost factor is still significantly high. I mean, we're fighting against a well-established paradigm that has great economies of scale. I mean, enormous economies of scale that really are a real challenge to kind of overcome. We were very optimistic about our ability to overcome it sort of with the general approach for biofuels that we're taking, rather than, in one of my previous lives, I worked for a company that we were actually growing algae and steel fermenters. So it was all about converting the sugar that we were feeding into something that was closer to biofuels that we could use at the most economical way. The route that Ryan took was basically, hey, we're just going to have a field with a big pit in it. We're going to feed it manure and other nitrogen sources. So as cheap as you could get, grow algae in this pit, recover the algae as cheaply as possible. Even then, the economics are so challenging. So that's I think, from my perspective, is one of the big areas we ultimately will need to overcome to get to successful biofuels.
And one more question on this, and then we'll move on to kind of the pivot. But when it comes to biofuels, is there a world down the road I know we're talking about electric cars and things like that are starting to really emerge and become more prominent. But at the same time, right, there's also a lot of questions of, well, what are the sources that are fueling the electricity that goes into those electric cars? And you still need to solve that issue. So is there a world where biofuels can become a prominent source of being the fuel that powers things or powers the things that lead to electric cars and things like that?
I think there are specific markets that it's difficult for me to see any way to get around it other than a biofuels type approach. For example, airplanes, right? The amount of weight that you would need to carry in an airplane from a battery perspective is enormous. Ships, commercial ships, things like that. So, while I think some of the greener technologies to replace much of our current fossil fuel dependency are going to continue to grow, and there's a path forward there, I think there are still massive markets that it's going to be difficult to overcome just from pure weight requirements for some of our current technologies.
So now moving into this pivot that you've made, talk about, was there existing technologies kind of already in place that you're utilizing to enable kind of this new business line, which is really this water remediation and cleaning up waterways?
Yes and no. Our technology is really based on two parts. One is we utilize well-established wastewater treatment technologies. Chemistry that we use to treat water has been around for decades. So the front half of our system is pretty straightforward. The back half of our system, which is something that we developed and designed ourselves, patented, is around this magnetic separation idea. That's really where, from our perspective, where the magic happens, and allows us to be able to do the things in the water remediation, water pollution treatment side that others cannot do. So the magnetic separation side allows us to basically take the power of a large wastewater treatment facility and shrink it down into a mobile unit that is something that we can basically haul out in an 8.5 by 16-foot trailer and go immediately to a site to mitigate acute water pollution issues.
What are some of the kind of early commercialized projects that you're focused on? And I'm also curious, there was so many years you're kind of working on the technology around Manta Biofuel, and now it seems as though you're making a relatively quick pivot to be able to kind of go online and start working in a commercial sense. So talk to me about how you've been able to move so quickly to kind of pivot into this space.
One, we have fantastic technology. So much of what we did in the early development phases to continue to optimize our separation technology was something that allowed us to really pivot pretty quickly into new applications with our technology. So I think that was a key component for us. I think the other piece is, a big focus for us last year was really to take this concept of something we had out in the field that was, sort of a bespoke system for our own purposes. It was great to then move to a system that we could produce a commercially viable platform with. That took a great amount of effort and a lot of pain, sweat, and effort went into sort of making that pivot. But a lot of the early learnings that we had on the biofuel side, we were able to then apply to what we wanted to do and sort of extend upon those as we were making the pivot into the water remediation side. One of the things that we did last year was really, focus on applying the technology and getting it into a system that was commercially viable. And then what we did is, we're a very strongly science-based organization, so we wanted to get out into the field as quickly as possible and show that our system worked. And, learn if it worked, to determine if it worked. And so we were very aggressive in doing that last year. We've done over 12 different pilot trials at scale in a variety of different markets. And in most markets, we're seeing great applications, great results with our applications. So I think it was that combination of building off of what we had already going for us from our biofuels years, being able to really apply the learnings there very quickly and then be pretty aggressive in trying to get out there and showing the success at scale.
Let's dive in on the magnetic technology that you're talking about. What does it do? How does it work?
The best analogy that I've heard is the chemistry that happens up front, the well-established wastewater treatment chemistry. Think of it like a sponge, right? So this chemistry happens and we have these microscopic sponges that are floating around in the water. Then contaminants such as excessive algae, sediment, phosphorus, nitrogen actually get collected in these sponges. No big deal. That happens. That's been happening for quite a while. The really fascinating and innovative part comes after that. So what we then do is in our system, we add something called magnetite. And magnetite is simply magnetic sand and naturally occurring. And in fact, if you've ever been at a beach and if you've seen sort of the black stripes that occur in the sand, that's most likely magnetite. So we have these dirty sponges, if you will. We add magnetite. The magnetite sticks to these dirty sponges. Now these dirty sponges are magnetic. That water then flows through our magnetic separation system, which is, for the simplest way to describe it, is a series of vertical discs. Water will flow through. The magnetic dirty sponges now stick to these discs. Discs rotate, they're scraped off and disposed of. And out the backside, you have clean water that comes out. So that's the simplest explanation of the way the magnetic separator works.
So what type of water is it that you're cleaning up? Who are you working for?
There are three markets that we're really targeting. The first market is wastewater lagoons. Now, 9-10 months ago, I had no idea what a wastewater lagoon was. And I'll try not to get too far into the weeds here, Chris, in terms of sort of wastewater treatment and all of that. But basically, a wastewater lagoon is one of the most common wastewater treatment systems in the United States, probably around the world. It's often used in smaller towns, rural towns. And effectively, it's a series of ponds that you have. Sewage, wastewater will come into one end of the pond. It will settle out. You'll have biological activity that happens. It'll flow into another pond, more of the same. And then ultimately, hopefully, coming out of the other side and going into a stream or a river, you'll have cleaner water. That's basically the concept. There are over 7,000 wastewater lagoons in the United States alone. Bad news is over 60% of these lagoons have had problems. Over 60% have had a compliance issue in the last couple of years. They have fine issues. They cannot operate, or they're discharging illegally, and you have some issues there, obviously, with water pollution. What we can do is we roll in with our system. If a lagoon operator is having difficulty with their compliance for discharge, we can roll in. Basically, trailer comes in. We have a hose that goes into the dirty water. Dirty water comes into our system. Clean water comes out the other side, and now we can help them get into a situation where whatever they're discharging is well within the compliance regulations. So that's the first market. Second market that we're looking at is more of an industrial application. We're working very closely with a great example of sort of other industrial applications. We're working with the Maryland Port Administration. The Port of Baltimore is a huge economic driver for Maryland, obviously. And annually, they have to dredge hundreds and thousands of acres of spoils from our shipping channels. They take these spoils and then they basically deposit them in these large open pits that are hundreds of acres wide. Water settles out. They take the solids and do something with the solids, whether it's backfill or whatever. But now they're stuck with this water that before it can be discharged has to meet certain EPA requirements. Can't be discharged. We've done some work with the port. We've gone in and shown that our technology can clean it up. And in fact, hopefully literally in a matter of weeks, we'll be finalizing a contract for going into for a paid phase 2 trial with them that could ultimately lead to purchase of some equipment from us. So that's the second market. And by the way, that problem is obviously not unique to Maryland. Wherever you have dredge spoils, you have commercial channels, commercial ports. Pretty nasty work that we've done there so far, but we have some real opportunities. Many of these plants use magnetite as part of their treatment process. And we have done some work that shows that we can improve their overall yield and recovery of the magnetite, as well as early indications suggest that we may have some technology that maybe a better mousetrap for some of the current technology that they're using. So again, early stages on that, but that's the third major market. And so any one of these markets, we are confident that we could build a really nice business for the company and for our investors, as well as do some real good for the environment.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you charge for these services? What does the business model look like?
The current business model is really is a service model. So it can be either you charge by the volume of water processed or by the amount of time we're on site. And our last paying gig, we did it based on amount of time we were there. So basically said, hey, we'll get your water to this period, to this quality and we estimate it'll take a month. And so we pay based on that, or we charge based on that. We also see that going forward. Again, many of these operations, for example, wastewater lagoons, will have intermittent problems. So we certainly see a situation where we can come in, operate our system for a given period of time, leave, and if they have more problems, we can come back or something like that. Our next phase that we see ultimately going with the business is moving from the service model into more of an equipment approach where we sell the equipment. We think there's a very clear market for that. The great piece about using the service model is effectively you're out there servicing very clearly prospective customers for people who can buy your equipment later. You're already building that portfolio of prospective equipment purchasers down the road. So that's kind of how we see it progressing.
Is there any competitors out there doing something similar to what you're doing today?
I know it sounds very questionable to say no, not that we're aware of. Probably our biggest competition, particularly on some of the wastewater treatment side, are well-established large municipal wastewater treatment plants. So you're talking massive, multi-million-dollar plants. That is probably our most immediate competitor. But obviously, for small towns or small communities where they may have a problem 4, 5, 6 months a year, and don't have the wherewithal or the population to warrant or justify a large infrastructure purchase like that, that's our most immediate competitor that we're aware of.
And willingness to pay in this space, it sounds like you'll be dealing with a lot of municipalities and things like that. I know a lot of times it can be hard to get budget out of those types of organizations.
There are a couple of angles to that, particularly on the service side. It's basically, do you pay a fine or do you pay for a service? Not to be too cheeky about it, but oftentimes it can come down to that. That's a big driver. I think the other piece too is that many of these communities, they're looking for options and alternatives. They want to do the right thing. And we've heard directly, we're working with some folks out in Illinois, and they basically said, look, we don't have a solution for this right now. We know, sometimes we have a discharge problem. I've got nothing. And so they were really very pleased to see us come and work with us. So very supportive. That's basically, what we've seen thus far. I think, when you get into things where, for example, we're talking about potentially treating large algal blooms, that gets to be a bit more challenging when you're talking about, the state, and you get a little bit of the finger pointing of, okay, well, who's actually going to write the check for this, to come clean up our lake? It's very different when you're the operator of a facility and you're out of compliance. So I think that helps a lot.
So you're in your first year of kind of commercialization of this new business line. Can you talk a little bit about what your revenue traction has looked like to date?
We're still very early stage revenue. I would probably even more classify us as pre-revenue. We had one paying job last year, working with a local community association for treatment of three of their ponds. And we are, say, the check's in the mail, but we are working with the Maryland Port Administration for a large paid project that we literally should be getting within any time now.
Nice. And then would the plan be kind of 2024 is the year where you really start to commercialize and charge for these services across the board?
Exactly. And so currently, as I'm sure you know, we're in our startup raise, our raise with Start Engine. The whole purpose of that raise is to generate some capital that will allow us to really build out and blow out our commercial activity. So build more machines and hire some more people to get out there and capture the potential that's been generated over the last 18 months.
So if you think about the next kind of 18 to 24 months, what does success look like for you at Manta?
A couple of things. Number one, we have built out multiple systems that will allow us to go out and really expand on our service model. Our initial focus will be here, and we're in Maryland, so sort of the Mid-Atlantic region. So that would be the first big thing. The second big thing would be geographic expansion sort of out west. We've been in some conversations with contract wastewater treatment companies. Basically, they manage, for example, we were talking to a company out in the Midwest, and they effectively manage over 100 different smaller wastewater treatment operations. They would be a perfect partner for us to go in and say, hey, we've got this technology. It can fix problems for your current clients, as well as it can be an entry for future clients. Gotten good interest from a couple of folks in the Midwest as well as on the West Coast. So that would be a path for us to expand our service business, much greater geography there. And then we flow into really starting to build out our equipment sales capability. So once we sort of seed the market, we follow on with very solid equipment sales for us moving forward.
And last question for you, is there a world where you do continue with the original technology of creating those biofuels as well? Is that part of the plan, or is that really kind of being deprioritized for the time being?
That's a great question. It is currently being deprioritized. However, we do see a world that where we could start to leverage what we're recovering in some of these jobs as a source for biofuels. So, for example, the Port Administration, that facility, they have a lot of algae in their water. That could certainly, it could make economic sense for us to then use that as a source. And by the way, they're going to continue to have a lot of algae in their water. That application would make sense for us to use that as a starting material, a feed material for us on the biofuel side. That actually, obviously changes the whole economic paradigm there, because instead of paying to grow the algae, now we're getting paid to recover the algae that we can then apply for biofuels down the road. So obviously we'll figure out how everything is weighted from a cost perspective, but that could certainly be a path that we could pursue down the road for sure.
Understood. Well, Chris, thank you very, very much for your time today. Obviously, this is a really interesting company, and I love the developments you're making to really commercialize and grow the business now. And obviously, for those who are interested, you could check them out at Start Engine if you would like to partake and invest in their current round of funding. Chris, thank you so very much again for your time and your insights, and thank you everyone for listening. Thanks so much for listening to the show. If you want to use the same tools I do to find amazing founders like the ones I have on the show to power your investment decisions, you could head on over to kingscrowd.com/startups to try out our Edge Toolkit for 30 days free.